Never stop reading Bible. And welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're plunging into a really specific bit of text you shared, Psalms 16 through 20. Okay, let's dig into it. Psalm 16 first. The guide says this is mostly David showing he's certain of God's salvation.
Yeah, absolutely certain. But what's really interesting is how the guide points out its sort of ultimate interpretation as a prophecy, pointing directly to Christ's resurrection.
Wow, okay. So how does the guide structure that?
Well, it lays it out nicely. First, David's faith, his stance with God, that's like verses 1 to 4. Then the blessings that flow from that, security, verses 5 to 11.
And the resurrection connection.
The guide sees David's hope, beyond death in those last few verses, 9 to 11, as specifically fulfilled when Jesus rose again. That's the key insight there.
Got it. Okay, so from that certainty, Psalm 17 kind of shifts gears. It brings us into a crisis situation.
Big shift, yeah. This is David pleading for help, basically saying, I'm innocent.
And the guide gives context for that.
It does. It suggests the background is probably David being falsely accused by Saul's people, servants trying to cause trouble for him.
Makes sense. So how does that psalm unfold, according to the guide?
It breaks down into like 3 parts. First, David appealing directly to God, asking for attention, saying, look, I'm innocent. That's verses 1 to 5.
Okay.
Then an urgent plea. Save me from my enemies. Yeah. Verses 6 to 12. They're aggressive.
And the ending.
He finishes, verses 13 to 15, looking forward to God's final salvation, finding his satisfaction there even while he's still in trouble.
Right. So plea for rescue. Then Psalm 18. This one the guide calls a major song of thanksgiving.
Huge Thanksgiving song. This is after God delivered him from Saul, from everyone. The guide even points out it's almost the same as 2 Samuel 22.
What's striking, though, is the guide noting David had this confidence while still on the run.
Exactly. It shows his underlying faith. And then the guide explains, once he's king, David looks back and thanks God as the source of it all. Protection, victory.
How's that structured?
The guide lays it out. Verses 1 to 3, his relationship with God is why he wins. Then 4:19, a really vivid picture of God stepping in.
Okay.
Verses 20-30 talk about divine rewards, God responding to faithfulness. And finally, 31:50, proclaiming the enemies are finished and just praising God.
So we've seen personal faith, crisis, national victory. Psalm 19 changes focus again.
It does. The guide splits this one in 2. First part, praising God just by looking at nature, seeing his power, his majesty in creation.
And the heavens declaring God's glory.
Exactly that. But then the second part, the guide highlights, is about God's special revelation, his law.
The Torah.
Right. That's where David finds God's specific will for salvation. The guide emphasizes the law's authority, its purity, in verses 7-11.
And how we should react to it.
Humility, wanting to be cleansed. That's verses 12-14. And interestingly, the guide points out Paul quotes this psalm in Romans 10, and it's part of his argument in Romans 1. So the guide sees it as theologically very significant.
Fascinating connection. Okay, last one, Psalm 20.
Right. The guide frames this as David praying before a battle.
Confident again.
Completely.
Hey.
Total conviction God will grant victory because it's a holy war in David's understanding. You have the people praying for the king.
And the king's already joyful.
Because he knows God has guaranteed the win. But here's the other layer the guide adds.
Let me guess. Messianic.
You got it. The guide sees the king here as representing Christ. So Psalm 20 becomes another messianic psalm, pointing to the ultimate king's guaranteed victory.
This deep dive into Psalms 16 through 20 was guided by insights found strictly within the Bible Guide source material. The deep dive is a production of the Center Studio.